Hey, just watched an interview with Alexei Navalny and the BBC's Stephen Sackur Hard Talk. It was from the presumably Moscow office of Alexei Navalny. Navalny is one of the most prominent opposition leaders in Russia. He has been charged with embezzlement. He alleges this is a political plot to stop him running in 2018. And indeed, that has just happened. He's now been barred for running, ostensibly because of this embezzlement charge. As he put it, though, if he's guilty, why would they have released him early on? He was sentenced to 5 years. He was released, as he put it, the following day. So there's things that don't add up here. Mr. Navalny, as I understand it, was the driving force behind the protests in 2011, 2012. I do remember those large-scale protests in Moscow and St. Petersburg. He's planning to run for president in 2018 against Putin. Um, the thing about Russia is Putin's been so dominant for so long, it's very difficult to see anyone else in power. But there's an interesting thing about this. At the height of the Cold War, it would have been very difficult to imagine any other system except the communist system that was in place. And of course, perestroika happened under Gorbachev, and history went as it did. The 1990s is generally seen as an unstable time in Russia. Um, if Alexei Navalny pushes forward with what he plans to do, which is to raise enough awareness so that public pressure will force the powers that be to let him stand, then he could stand. I doubt he'll become the next Russian president. I would be extremely surprised if that happened. But he might be able to make enough noise in order to actually be the one opposition leader that does finally put a brake on Putin's power. Of course, many previous dissidents, opposition leaders, call them what you will, have met unpleasant fates. Boris Nemtsov was assassinated yards from the Kremlin in 2015. Other Putin critics, journalists, and politicians have mysteriously died. Anna Politkovskaya, Alexander Litvinenko, of course, are two well known cases. Um, and Alexei Navalny himself was attacked in a so called Zelyonka attack, I believe it is, which is a Russian word, as I understand it, for the brilliant green, the vibrant green dye that is used to throw over opposition activists. And footage emerged earlier this year of Mr. Navalny with this green paint all over his face. Some thugs had attacked him with that. Um, Luckily, it didn't cause him permanent blindness or anything like that, but it did cause some temporary burns. It's a particularly vicious way to try and silence dissent. Um, so I'm going to basically discuss here my thoughts on this, my thoughts on what chances Navalny has, and also on the situation in Russia under Putin. Um, Firstly, as Navalny himself said, he's not naive. He understands how powerful the current system is. I have to say, I don't know a huge deal about Alexei Navalny other than what I've just said, that he is an opposition leader. So I'm not going to be a PR man for him and say he's going to be like, the people's champion or whatever, because some of Putin's critics are not exactly savory characters themselves. I'm not saying that about Mr. Navalny, but um, some of these tycoons are not entirely savory characters themselves. So I don't want to present, I don't want to sort of be a PR man for Alexei Navalny when I don't know everything about him. I will say, though, that by definition it takes courage to stand up against the Putinist system. Russia is a mockery of a democracy. Ostensibly, it's a democracy, it's a multi party system. But what always happens is that United Russia, Putin's party, has like 90% of the airtime. Now, I'm going to have a quick analysis here of the Putin years, and this is by no means comprehensive, but it's basically as I see it. I will admit I'm biased because I am a big critic of Putin and Putinism, so I'm not going to pretend that I'm neutral about this because I'm not. Um, I do understand why Putin came to power, and I do understand why Putin has enjoyed very high popularity over the years. In the 1990s, Yeltsin was seen as a bit of an oaf, a bit of a buffoon. not least because he was often drunk. And the Yeltsin years are basically associated with economic stagnation and the humiliation of Russia. After the Cold War ended, Russia was seen to have been weakened. It was seen to have been humiliated because it was once a superpower, then it declined. Something akin to what Britain went through in the 50s, although on a bigger scale. Um, and I think that that humiliation went very, very, very deep to the core of the Russian nationalist psyche. So, Russian nationalists like Putin find this unforgivable to the sort of national pride. Russia is a very proud nation, and understandably so. It's a great nation, world class literature, culture, um, and it was a superpower. I mean, that cannot be understated. So I fully understand that reaction to what was deemed to be a humiliation on the world stage. The problem is Putin and Putinism went way too far, and it's Russia is there's no way it can be called a real democracy. The way that Putin has absolutely dominated Russian politics, he has essentially had an iron grip on power since 2000. True, Dmitry Medvedev had those 4 years as president, but I really think that was a facade. It's not that Medvedev was a totally weak leader, but he really was always a secondary figure to Putin. So that period where Putin ostensibly acted as his prime minister and it was a tandem system, um, I don't think Medvedev was entirely fully his own man. Yes, there was a little bit of a thaw in relations with the West, but I really think that Putin has been absolutely dominant now in Russia for 17 years. And if he does win re-election next year, which is very probable, then he will be the longest serving Russian leader since Leonid Brezhnev. Very, very, very influential figure in the world stage. On several occasions, Forbes has ranked him as the most powerful man in the world. He may even be the most wealthy man in the world. No one knows about Putin's secret, possibly billions. No one knows the exact wealth this man has. So no question about it, Putin's an immensely powerful figure. But that power is not absolute. Um, in the last presidential election, 2012, Putin did enjoy a comfortable win, but it was somewhat lower than Medvedev's win in 2008 and Putin's win in 2004. In Putin's last win, he got something like 79%. In 2012, it was 62, 64%, something around that. So Putin's popularity, I believe, is in the decline. Now, a big problem in Russia, like I say, it's a facade of a democracy. It is not a democracy in any acceptable sense of the word. Not that I believe there's any perfect democracy, but when you have one man basically getting the vast bulk of airtime, that's a facade. I want to be clear. I don't necessarily believe that some of the opposition figures out there would be better than Putin. In fact, in some cases, I think where they would be downright worse. Take, for example, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, a despicable character, an outright fascist, a horrible, horrible man. And, given a choice between Putin and someone like Zhirinovsky, definitely I would choose Putin. Putin's clearly a very capable leader in terms of galvanizing a personality cult. Um, Is he a dictator? Well, dictator's a strong word, but he is definitely a very authoritarian figure, and he is definitely wafer thin, one level before an outright dictator. The only reason I say he's not an outright dictator is Russia is marginally better than some authoritarian states in terms of freedom. Nevertheless, very often opposition protests are banned, opposition activists are arrested on charges of hooliganism, and yet, interestingly enough, the same charges are not brought against pro Kremlin thugs who harass and intimidate anyone who criticizes Putin. So, yeah, in some ways, it really isn't that far off a dictatorship. Um, Russia's foreign policy under Putin has been ultra nationalist, very aggressive. I mean, if you look at the series of wars that Putin has had, clearly this is a man who not only wants to rebuild the Soviet Union, he wants to, on the surface, rebuild the Russian Empire. The way Putin has threatened smaller states is despicable. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is what it was, needs to be called for what it was. Stephen Harper, the then Canadian Prime Minister, was one of the few world leaders who stood up to Putin, and I give Harper credit. What I don't understand, there's very strange attitudes in the West that people. There's something that the populist left and the populist right have in common, and it's something I really have no respect for. They have a great admiration for Putin, and it is something that is quite astonishing. And it's hypocritical on both sides. It's hypocritical on the left because they are usually the first to preach about human rights, preach about sovereignty, preach about warmongering, preach about all these things, which Putin is absolutely guilty of. I mean, Russia's brutal war in Chechnya, both of them, the second Chechen war under Putin, um, some of the things that Russia done were absolutely war crimes, no question about it. And I understand these wars were brutal. I'm not saying the other sides were entirely innocent either. And I'm sure there's young Russian soldiers who had no choice but to go to those war zones. And the way Russia treats its soldiers is one of the worst in the world in terms of how it treats its troops. Um, the level of suicides among Russian troops is appalling. Um, One of the biggest problems I see in Russia is you have state media which is really, really aggressive. Now, a country like China also has state controlled media, but it tends to be a little bit more internalized. What I mean by that is that the likes of Xinhua and CGTN has an international outlook, but it tends to be a bit more diplomatic. I know this because I have it. I have access to it. They tend to be a bit more diplomatic when they're talking about other countries. Russia Today, which is the number one state broadcaster, it's an absolute. I've made my views on RT clear. I despise RT. Why? Because I think it is nothing but a mouthpiece for the Kremlin. I call it Putin news because that's what it is. RT, ever since its inception, has been done nothing but aggressively, constantly attack the West at every single opportunity, every single thing they will put a negative slant. Everything. They will never, ever, ever have a positive report on the British, American, or French governments, ever. Um, no, they might charge, oh, well, the BBC and CNN does the same thing with Russia. Maybe so. But there is an important thing to consider here. Voice of America, which is the American state broadcaster, does not currently have access in Russia. RT has access to the British and American markets. So ask yourself, which side is more tolerant? RT can freely pump out their propaganda into the British and American markets. They can throw out all the conspiracy theories they want. They can invite on people on the show who are disgruntled with the government, and that's it. There's no restrictions on it. Occasionally, there may be some restrictions, but the fact of the matter is, RT has a lot more freedom in the West than most Western outlets have in Russia. Fact. RT never criticizes Putin. RT definitely doesn't show opposition rallies. Um, and I think that's one of the biggest problems in terms of Putinism. So this facade that Putin's extremely popular, I think he is popular, but I do wonder, is RT and other networks that are pro-Kremlin, are they covering up the fact that actually this popularity is in decline? Like I say, in the last election it was 62%. In previous elections, Putin's enjoyed 70-80%. So clearly there is a changing attitude there. Um, and I think that, like I say, one thing I don't get with the populist right and the populist left, they're always the first to blame. I mean, in the case of the populist right in America, Obama was responsible for everything. They would never ever fathom the idea that actually Putin's a very powerful world figure. What about Putin's role? What about the fact that Russia has been arming the murderous Assad regime? Fact, the Assad regime started the Syrian war. That's a fact. And there's no way to gloss that over. What happened was teenagers in Daraa, back in late 2011, early 2011 in fact, were interrogated because they sprayed anti-government graffiti on a wall. They were interrogated, basically tortured. The regime then brutally crushed protests which were set up to free those young men, and it got it drastically escalated. Russia wanted to get insert its influence in the region, so they propped up the Assad regime. Now, the caveat to this is people will say, "Oh, but what about the West supporting Saudi Arabia, etc., etc." Well, I've always said that when I criticize Russia, it's not about saying the West is innocent. That has never been my position. But the point about pro-Putin people is they're not objective. They never even try to play the devil's advocate and say, okay, well, maybe Putin was wrong about this. They blindly worship Putin. And this shows the power of this personality cult. Um, in Russia, you get Putin youth camps. This is a personality cult. The Kremlin employs people online that aggressively push Russian nationalism. I won't be surprised if I get a few of them in this video. I won't be surprised if I get people thumbing down this video, coming on and say, oh, you're a globalist, New World Order type, Nathan. What about British this? What about British that? Here's the thing. In Russia, dissent has no voice. It's aggressively silenced. Look at what happened with Mr. Navalny, attacked by thugs on the street. So the point I would make, and this is true of every authoritarian regime, when opposition figures, when dissenters are silenced within a country, it's a responsibility for outsiders to speak out. So it's not a case that I am saying every single opposition figure in Russia is a great person and they would necessarily be better than Putin. But I do think that Putin is running his course. This is a man who, far from bringing stability in the world, has played a massive role, I would argue, in creating instability and fueling a potential new Cold War. This is not someone we should be praising. And I do not understand the mindset of Westerners who grovel to Putin. I mean, that's what I don't get about the right. They're always quite rushing to judge left wingers for treason and being traitors, yet they're supporting and praising a foreign demagogue. Give me a break. As for the left, like I say, there's hypocrisy there too, because the things that they claim to hold dear, the things that they attack Western governments for, Putin is absolutely guilty of. And even China, which is, not exactly known for defending Western values, has criticized Russia for interfering in other countries. What happened in Ukraine was an outright subjugation, no question about it. And there is a big difference with that and the invasion of Iraq. Whatever you think of the invasion of Iraq, and I think that was a huge disaster. I think it was one of our worst ever foreign policy blunders. In the end of the day, that wasn't about permanent occupation. In the case of Ukraine, it was about basically annexing Crimea with a phony referendum. Pro-Ukrainians were prevented from voting in that referendum. It was a complete setup. And that's what Russia done. It basically subjugated a sovereign nation. People act like Ukraine is, they say, oh, well, we're taking on fascist Ukraine. I have no doubt that there's fascist components in Ukrainian society, but to dismiss the whole of Ukraine as fascist, to justify subjugating that country, is utterly absurd. It's not that different from what Hitler done in the late 30s, claiming that he was protecting German speakers in Central Europe. This is a track record of Putinism. Now, to be fair, probably in some areas, Putin has done some good things for Russia. He probably has brought a degree of stability that was better than the Gorbachev-Yeltsin years. Probably the economy has risen under Putin, although it's still very far from, it's still not even in the top 10 per capita GDPs. I'm not going to say the Putin era has been entirely bad. I want to be fair, but that, trying to be fair only goes to a certain extent because, like I say, what we see in Russia is an outright personality cult. So, what I would say in advance to any Putinists who want to come on here and say, I don't know what I'm talking about, and you want to cheer for Tsar Vlad, this is a man with massive, massive amounts of blood on his hand. This is a man whose regime has silenced critics. I know the Kremlin always denies it, but give me a break. Do you really think it's a coincidence that all these journalists have accidents and they're murdered by gangsters? Come off it. They all just happen to criticize Putin. That's, it's just a coincidence. Come on. The way Putin's behaving is like an old style Soviet dictator. But this is the most powerful man in Russia probably since Stalin. And I'm even considering figures like Khrushchev and Brezhnev. Um, this year marks 100 years since the Russian Revolution. Um, will there be a revolution next year? It's highly unlikely, but I do think that at some point the number of protests are going to start to override the power of Russian state media in propping up Putin. We've seen some very big protests in this decade. We've seen the Arab Spring protests. We've seen the Occupy movement. We've seen the umbrella protests in Hong Kong. Now, to what extent those had any effect in terms of change is a matter for debate. But people power really has been a big feature of this 2010s decade. And I think that sort of movement in Russia would be massive. It would be huge. I don't want to see a weak Russia, but I do want to see a Russia that is not so dominated by one man. That is not democracy. And so long as Putin is at the helm, there are going to be tensions with the West. You can say, oh, it's all the fault of Western leaders. So blame all the British prime ministers, blame all the American presidents. Or you can say, oh, well, Putin's perfect. Putin doesn't do anything wrong. He's a great leader. All hail Tsar Vlad. I just don't buy that. That one man is right and a dozen other leaders are wrong. Because the attitude that Putin takes, whatever approach the West takes, there's going to be. I'm not saying the West is entirely innocent. Probably the enlargement of the EU and the enlargement of NATO wasn't entirely helpful, but that's still no reason to invade a sovereign nation in Ukraine. I'll leave it there. Yes, this video is biased. I'm not pretending otherwise. I am a critic of Putin. I am a huge critic of Russia today, and believe me, when it's a case of dissidents being roughed up by thugs on the street, don't ask me, don't expect me to be fair, because that's authoritarianism. It's something that I will never defend. So that's how I see it.